Good morning, everybody. Hope you guys are all doing well, handling the heat okay. Today, we'll be talking about Abraham. Last year I preached, right about a year ago, I preached here for the first time. I mentioned that Hezekiah is my favorite person in the Bible and my personal hero from the Bible. I actually have three heroes from the Bible. I call them my Holy Triumvirate. I used to call them my personal Holy Trinity, but that came off as a little blasphemous. But yeah, I have three favorite people in the Bible, and Hezekiah is definitely the top of the list. But the other two are Stephen the Martyr is another one, and Abraham are the three people I really looked up to. And we'll be looking at Abraham. And I'll be honest, when I was a kid, learning about Abraham, Father Abraham and many sons, etc., I didn't really understand what the big deal was with him. I didn't really get why he was so praised, because as near as I could tell, his entire contribution to the biblical story was that he had a kid, which, he was married. Those people tend to do that, married man, slept with his wife and got her pregnant. What an incredible sacrifice he made, So I didn't really get it. But during my college years, I went to Bible college, and I took an introduction to philosophy class, where I was introduced to a philosopher named Soren Kierkegaard, and a book that he wrote called Fear and Trembling, which really focused on the story of Abraham. And it ended up being one of those books that changed my life. It really changed my perspective on not only Abraham, but on Christianity and religion in general. And it's something, if I had my way, it would be something that every Christian is required to read that ever becomes Christian. And we're going to be looking at a lot of the ideas found in this book. But we'll be jumping around a little bit, but first let's look at the main passage, which is... Can we get this working? Okay, there we go. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1 to 5a. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. Now, I'll be honest, passages like this really exemplify something I find a little frustrating about the Bible sometimes, which is that they really leave out a lot of the sort of emotional detail. Because if we look at this passage, if we add no other context, no other subtext, and we just take this passage as face value, it would seem that God told him to go to Canaan, and Abraham just went. It was that easy, right? No complaints, no internal struggling, nothing. But consider that, I'm going to call them Abraham and Sarah, by the way, not Abram and Sarai, just to keep things simple. But consider that Abraham was already married at this point. He had already married Sarah. Again, if we take this passage at face value, Sarah was not there. It said that God spoke to Abraham, not Abraham and Sarah. So Abraham would have had to go back to Sarah and tell him about this, right? Now, how many of you, imagine your spouse comes to you, all right? Now, imagine a country, all right, that you have zero connection to. You've never been there. You don't know anything about it. You don't know any people there. You have no connection to it. You would not even think of this country except that I'm telling you to think about it, okay? For me, for some reason, whenever I think of a random country, that country is Zimbabwe. I have no idea why I think of Zimbabwe. I have no idea where that came from. But for whatever reason, when I think of just a far-off random country somewhere, I think of Zimbabwe. Now, maybe you guys have connection to Zimbabwe, in which case, whenever I say Zimbabwe, think of a different country, whatever country, that you have no connection to. But imagine your spouse comes to you and says, God told me to go to Zimbabwe because he's going to make me a great person there. So let's get packing, let's go. How many of you would be like, if God told you to go, yeah, let's start packing, let's go. Anybody? Okay, one person would, all right. most of us there would be a conversation, right? There would be a talk to figure things out. What might you ask your spouse? Okay, what is God going to do out there? How is he going to make you a great person? I have no idea. He didn't say anything. He just told me to go, so we got to go. Okay. Do you have a job lined up? Do you have something you can do out there? Do you know people who can help you get something? Do you know anything? I've never been there. I don't know anything. This is totally new. Nothing. Okay. So when you get out there, what are you going to do? What's your plan? Oh, I have no plan. God told me to go, and I have no way to do this. He told me to go, so I'm going to go. Okay, how about this, honey? We'll pray about it. We'll look into Zimbabwe. We'll do some research and figure out a plan. And maybe, in a year, maybe in 6 months or so, we'll probably be ready to head out there. How about that? Oh, no. We don't need to research. We don't need to pray about it. No, God told me to do this. It's all covered, right? Does this sound sensible to anybody? Does this sound rational? This sounds insane, right? There's probably, do we have any psychology majors here? There's probably some disorders that describe what's going on here, right? Would it be schizophrenia for hearing the voice of God? Messiah complex or narcissism for God's going to make me a great man, right? No, this is crazy. And especially, and to add another layer of complication to this, it would seem that Abraham was rich. We found out in chapter 13 that Abraham was rich in livestock, gold, and silver, to the point that they had to complete their journey in multiple stages so that they can bring everything along with them. Now, if Abraham was poor, you can imagine this might have been an easier decision. He was down on his luck, didn't really have much else going on in his life, and God tells him, if you go over here, I'm going to give you a new life, and I'm going to make you a great person. That's a very attractive offer for somebody who has nothing. But no, Abraham was rich. He was wealthy. He presumably had a great life. The one thing that would have been missing is he didn't have a child, which we'll talk about that later. But other than that, he had a great life. He had his family there. So this would have been a very difficult decision for him. I would have to guess, anyway. Again, based on this, doesn't seem to be. But now, some people might say, well, it might have been a difficult decision for other people, but Abraham was a believer of God. He was following God. God called him. No problem, right? Well, let's consider Exhibit B. Genesis 11:27-31. Now, these are the descendants of Terah. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot out of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So it's generally understood that Abraham was born in Ur of the Chaldeans. This city is generally associated with the Sumerian city of Ur. This is, however, disputed. The big point of contention is the of the Chaldeans part. The Chaldeans were a people group that were eventually absorbed by the Babylonians, and in terms of understanding the Bible, Chaldeans and Babylonians are basically the same thing. They're interchangeable. In fact, later on in 2 Kings, after Babylon becomes the dominant power in this region and they sack Jerusalem and destroy the temple, it will say something along the lines of people ran away to Egypt because they were afraid of the Chaldeans. So Chaldeans, Babylonians, interchangeable in the Bible. Well, the problem here is that the Babylonians and the Chaldeans didn't arrive in this area until like the 9th century BC. Abraham is believed to have died somewhere around 2000 BC. So that's over 1,000 year difference depending on your interpretation. So some scholars will argue that this must then refer to a different city of Ur, somewhere where the Chaldeans were in control. The more common consensus seems to be that we're seeing here an edit of the Bible that would have been understood for more modern audiences, people after the Babylonian exile. It would be kind of like if we had read a Korean history book, and it said, during this time in the Joseon dynasty, many people lived in South Korea. Well, there was no South Korea during the Joseon dynasty. But using that kind of language helps the modern reader kind of get a better picture of where all this is happening. Scholars believe that that's what's going on here, that of the Chaldeans part was added later on to be understood by more modern audiences. So most common consensus is that this is Ur of Sumer. From Ur, he moves to Haran, and which is pretty much universally understood to be the modern-day city of Haran, which is in modern-day Turkey. Now, both of these cities, Ur and Haran, were well within the bounds of what will eventually become the Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian empires. The significance of this is that the religion in this region was very unified. It was all pretty homogeneous. They all believed the same pantheon of gods. This is what is known today as the Mesopotamian religion. This is the religion that produced the Enuma Elish, if you guys are familiar with that. That's the creation story of the Mesopotamian religion. This is a story where the great dragon Tiamat was defeated by the mighty hero Marduk, and then Marduk used her body parts to form the world. Later on, when Cyrus the Great conquers Babylon, he would spread propaganda saying that this was Marduk's will. So this was the major religion of this region. That's Marduk and Tiamat. I remember reading the Enuma Elish in college, and when I saw Tiamat, I sort of did a double take, because Tiamat has a whole new significance in sci-fi nerd talk. She's the great evil dragon in Dungeons and Dragons, so as soon as I saw that, I sort of had one of those moments. Yeah. But anyhow, so this was the religion. And in fact, one thing really interesting that I discovered during while I was researching this is that both Ur and Haran, both of these cities, were centers of worship for one particular god of this religion called Sin, also called Nana. I'll say Nana just to avoid confusion. Nana was the moon goddess of this religion. So Abraham moved from one center of worship to Nana to another center of worship to Nana. I find that really interesting, and I can't help but wonder if there's a story there. One more thing to consider is that religion was practiced very differently back then. In modern times, religion is a very individual, personal thing. You have your religion, I have my religion, and we just sort of stay apart. Even within the same religion, even within Christianity, you have your personal relationship with God. I have my personal relationship with God. It's going to look different, and that's okay. That idea didn't really exist in ancient times. Religion was very much a communal, societal thing. In fact, if you go back to other older religions, one common story that you'll find in many different religions is where an entire community is being punished because one person practiced the religion wrong. Oftentimes that's because they did their sacrifice wrong or something. Even the Bible has its own version of that idea. So no, religion was very different back then. Everybody in society was accountable to everybody else in that same society for the way that they practiced their religion. So to recap, Abraham was born in a region with a very unified, institutionalized religion. He spent most of his life in two particular cities that would have been saturated with the worship and rituals of one particular god of that religion. And remember, he was rich. I'm assuming that his family got that money legitimately, which means that he probably was involved in some kind of trade. He was very successful. There were no internet entrepreneurs back then. You couldn't make millions of dollars just sitting at home like you can apparently do today. I have personally yet to crack that formula, but apparently it can be done. No, if you wanted to make money, you had to get out there and work. You had to network. If he was successful, if he was rich, he would have been well connected in society. If he was well connected, he was well accepted in society. In a society that would have had religious expectations of its members. You put all that together, I think a very strong argument could be made that Abraham was probably actively practicing the local religion at the time that he was called. So he was not even a believer of this God who had just called him. Now, some scholars will disagree with that. They will argue that the worship of our God, Yahweh, will have survived into this time. In fact, in chapter 14, Abraham will encounter a man called Melchizedek, and he is identified as a priest of the Most High God. So not only did the knowledge of Yahweh exist in this time, but it would exist to the point that there was an organized priesthood going on here. And since Abraham was a descendant of Noah and came from that whole lineage, these scholars will argue that Abraham would certainly know about Yahweh and would probably worship him. And so therefore, if he did give worship to Nana, it would have been lip service. I think the more plausible explanation, though, is that people back then were what's called polytheistic. They believed in multiple gods. More specifically, many of them were what's called henotheistic, which means that there were multiple gods, but there was only one that mattered to you. Oftentimes, depending on where you lived or your job. The fishermen might worship the god of the oceans. Merchants had their own gods. Blacksmiths had their own gods, etc., etc., etc. So if I had to guess, and this is all speculation, of course, but if Abraham did in fact know about Yahweh, it just wouldn't have mattered to him at that point. At that point, he was living in Ur and Haran. He was living in the cities of Nana. It was to Nana that he would have owed his allegiance. That, I think, is the most plausible scenario of what's going on. I might note at this point that this is all speculation. There is zero authoritative accounts of what happened, what Abraham's life was like before the call. So this is all just sort of piecing it together. But yeah, I think a very strong argument could be made that Abraham was probably worshiping a different god at this point. The only possible clue that we have is in Romans 4, when Paul is talking about Abraham, and he mentions justifying the ungodly. And some scholars interpret that as a reference to Abraham having been called out of an idolatrous religion. But again, no one knows for sure. So again, taking all that into consideration, I don't think anyone would have really faulted Abraham if he had said no to God. It would have made, in fact, I think the argument could very much be made that his accepting God's call was, from the logistical perspective, completely irrational and irresponsible. He had a wife, he had a life, he had a family, no children, but he lived with his family. He had a family to take care of, he had a business to run, etc. And what's pretty amazing, though, is that that's not the last time that God would call him to make an irrational decision, right? He would have to make a similarly irrational decision later on. Genesis 22, 1-3. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to Abraham, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. I might know, by the way, this is the story that Kierkegaard uses as the premise of the ideas in his book. He looks at this story from a really, really fascinating perspective, and we'll be covering a small portion of that today. I really, really recommend that you guys read this book. This is, just an amazing book. Now, again, frustrating lack of details. Again, from here, it seems like Abraham, okay, sure, and just went. I have to imagine this was a really agonizing decision for Abraham, that this decision would have really broken his heart. This baby, the idea of sacrificing, your child, I'm sure is, a big deal for everybody. This was several times more complicated for Abraham and Sarah. In ancient cultures, it says that Sarah was barren. In ancient cultures, this would have been a great source of shame for Sarah. Now, in modern times, we understand that there are many medical and scientific reasons why that happened, and there's nothing wrong with that. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the woman. But in ancient times, they didn't understand that. Ancient times, barrenness was a curse from the gods. This would have made her an outcast from society. This would have been a source of great shame and great dishonor to their family. And again, especially when you consider that his family was rich, a prominent family that's supposed to be, a beacon in society, and the wife of one of their sons is barren, that would have been a huge source of shame. People would have looked at Sarah, I'm not exaggerating about this, people would have looked at Sarah and wondered, why do you even exist? When you can't even do the one thing that women back then believed were supposed to do, the primary duty of women from their perspective. They would have looked at Abraham and wondered why he doesn't get a new wife. Again, which would have been his right back then. In a lot of society, if your wife couldn't provide a kid, you had every right to leave them and find a wife who could. This was all normal back then. So yeah, this would have been a major source of shame and dishonor. Abraham was 75 when he was called to Canaan. Sarah, I believe, was about 10 years younger than that. I would speculate that he and Sarah probably would have been trying to have a child for a long time, probably at that age might have given up. And actually, some scholars believe that this child was the single biggest factor in Abraham and Sarah being willing to take this call. The promise of a son was the clincher that made them follow God's call. Some scholars believe. Now, one thing that's very commonly overlooked is that Abraham was 75 when he was called. He was 100 when they had Isaac. So after God told him and made all these promises to him, he was waiting 25 years for even a single sign of the fulfillment of that promise. 25 years, wondering what's going on. When is this going to happen? God made this promise to me. When is it finally going to happen? 25 years. And finally, they have a son. After 25 years, they have a son. And not only would this remove the stigma and dishonor and shame from their family, but consider everything that I just described about the life that they left behind and the huge sacrifice they made. This would have been the first sign for them. From their perspective, this would have been the first sign that maybe this God is for real. That this sacrifice that we made, this calling that we followed, this was the right decision. 25 years they waited with nothing. And finally, they get their first sign that maybe this was all worth it. And what does God tell them to do? Kill him. Sacrifice him. Again, taking the passage at face value, God tested Abraham. God talked to Abraham. Sarah was not there. Kierkegaard speculates that Abraham probably wouldn't have said anything to Sarah because, speculation of course, but would Sarah have really gone along with it? Would she have understood that this son that they've been waiting there 100 years for, and Abraham wants to kill him? Would they have understood that? Kierkegaard also notes that Abraham was basically jumping headlong into a life of being probably a fugitive. Maybe his wife would have understood. Maybe Sarah would have retained that same, faith in God that led them to follow this calling here. Society certainly wouldn't have understood that. Eventually, news would get out that Abraham killed his son. He would be hunted to the end of the earth. He would be considered a baby killer. This was a huge, huge deal. This was another crazy, crazy calling, insane, irrational calling that God gave him. And what did Abraham do? He got up early in the morning to do this. No hesitation, no delay, no putting it off, nothing. He got up early in the morning to obey. So why would he do these things? What could possibly cause somebody to make these insane decisions, these completely irrational decisions? Kierkegaard saw only two possibilities. He said, in the time before the outcome being when Abraham was almost killed Isaac. In the time before the outcome, either Abraham was a murderer every minute, or we stay with the paradox, which is higher than all mediation. So for Kierkegaard, Abraham was either a psychopathic murderer who had no problem doing these things, or we are seeing something here that is completely beyond our human comprehension. That makes absolutely no sense. So what is this? What makes this make sense? What was it in Abraham that made all this acceptable to him? And Kierkegaard's answer was, it was his faith. Kierkegaard had a faith, or Abraham rather, had a faith which made all this make sense. And this is the part that I find really frustrating about Kierkegaard's book, and probably why I like that book so much is because I find it so frustrating, is that Kierkegaard notes that faith in itself is, I forget the exact word he used, but it's madness. He never really questions the idea that Abraham might have been a little crazy. That faith made him crazy. Kierkegaard said, faith is a paradox which is capable of transforming a murder into a holy act well pleasing to God. Kierkegaard notes that Abraham both believed that his son would die and at the same time believed that his son would live. We see in the Bible that, yes, that's kind of true. He was sort of expecting both. Faith is this completely irrational, crazy thing, but within that faith, in the presence of that faith, Abraham followed this God. And these decisions were completely rational and logical for him. Something about that initial encounter with God back in chapter 12 instilled within Abraham a faith, a belief, and a trust in God that made all this make sense. Now, once again, frustrating lack of details. What exactly was that conversation like? I'm really, really curious about that. Was it a thunderous voice from the heavens? Did God take human form and talk to him like he did before Sodom and Gomorrah? Was it kind of like the modern understanding of calling where we feel a tug at our hearts and follow it? We don't know. The word there is said. It is, I only have 2 semesters of Hebrew, so take this how you will, but the word is as neutral a word for said as you'll find in the Bible. It communicates nothing as far as what specifically that might have looked like. Whatever it was, whatever happened there, it instilled within Abraham a faith that made all this make sense for him. And in a lot of ways, that's what's happening today with us. We believe in this God that we've never seen, that we've never heard, that we'll probably not see or hear until we're dead. But for the sake of this God, we make decisions that will affect our entire lives. Many of us are willing to die. I'm not, but many people are willing to die. Many people make all sorts of crazy sacrifices for this God. And in that faith, all of that makes sense. One thing I find that really bothers me, and I hear this a lot in evangelism and music, is when Christianity is portrayed in these very idyllic terms. Come to God and He will give you peace in your life. Give your worries to God and He will lead you through gentle streams and you will never hunger again. Has anyone actually experienced this? Anybody? You become Christian and your life is just smooth sailing afterwards, right? You have no problems anymore because God is the solution to all your problems, right? All your worries and concerns of the world, you don't worry about that anymore because God's in your life. No, none of that. I would argue that that's actually quite dangerous to think like that, to evangelize like that, because it gives people false expectations. Being Christian is a difficult life. It really is. It complicates your life because now it's not just about what makes you happy. It's not just about what's good for you, what makes you more money. Now you have to work. Now it's an added level of decision making. What does God want from me? What does the Bible say? Now, maybe there are those of you out there who are such, pure hearts, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, that for you, being Christian is not difficult. Your normal life is very similar to your Christian life, and if you're one of those people, God bless you. I am definitely not one of those people, I can tell you that right now. I'm a bit of a hedonist at heart. I'm a lazy hedonist at heart. I would totally admit that. If I wasn't Christian, I'd be... Well, I'm also an extreme introvert and a giant nerd. So for me, my idea of a good time is like staying home and marathoning Star Wars or something like that, So I wouldn't be out... I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be out there doing anything too crazy. But the point still remains, I've been making my decisions based on what makes me happy, what I want to do. I wouldn't care about what God's calling me to do. I wouldn't care about what is good for the church and what is right according to the Bible. These things complicate our lives. And I'm not saying they should, but they do. It makes life even more difficult. And it will not make sense to the rest of the world. The world will look at us, the way that we live our lives, the factors that we consider when we make our decisions, and they will see irrational. It will not make sense to them. And the reason it doesn't make sense to them is because they don't share our faith. The faith that Abraham had, that Kierkegaard said Abraham was the father of faith, who exhibited greater faith than anybody else. That faith is what makes what I just described, the difficulty that I described, completely worth it. It's that faith that makes all of that completely make sense. And later on, Paul would talk about Abraham. I believe I added this to the slide. Yeah, Romans 4:18-22. And he's, he did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which is already as good as dead, for he was about 100 years old. I find that really funny, by the way. That's kind of it sounds like a really mean thing to say, but yeah. Or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. Therefore, his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Therefore, his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. And look what ended up happening. God kept every promise that he made to Abraham. Perhaps not in his lifetime. He didn't get to see a lot of it, but they all came true. God said that he would make Abraham's name great. In modern times, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are three of the biggest religions in the world, and they all revere Abraham. That's over 50% of the world's population today. God said that through him, all families of the earth would be blessed. Well, it was through his bloodline, the bloodline of Abraham and Isaac, that the knowledge of God was restored to the world and spread throughout. And it was through his bloodline that eventually came Jesus Christ, our Savior. He was absolutely a blessing to all the world. So was his decision rational? It was completely rational. It may not have made sense to him at the time. It may not make sense to the rest of the world, but in our faith, in the unfaltering faith that Abraham had, he understood that this is what he had to do. The decision was completely rational to him, as it now is to us. I will reiterate my personal opinion that living as proper Christians is difficult. It is. I really, really don't get when people talk about Christianity. Not to say that's a bad thing, of course, it's a great thing. But I really don't get people who say Christianity is just, makes life easier. I don't understand that at all, honestly. We're called to live differently than we normally might. We're called to think differently, make decisions based on different criteria than what is natural to us. And all for great reward that we're not even going to get to see, that we're not going to get to enjoy until we're dead. Just like Abraham did not get to see his reward during his lifetime. And this life will not make sense to the world. Why make those sacrifices? Why think of anything other than yourself? Why think of anything other than your pleasure and your enjoyment? Why add all these layers of complication to your decision-making? And the world will continue to criticize us for this, continue to look down on us for this. But as Christians, let's continue to make those decisions and continue to live those lives and think about our decisions and make those decisions based on our faith. Our faith that God knew what he was doing when he called us to this life. That God understands how irrational some of this is, but calls us to it anyway. Let's have faith in that God. Let's have faith in that calling so that one day that faith, just like Abraham, can be reckoned to us as righteousness. Amen.